so much for being here. I guess that's a great way to start, is we tried to connect, get started with this video, and had a little bit of an attack, a gravity attack. Episode 5 of this conversation, I wanted to have a conversation about attachment. And I did preface in that first airing of this topic that one of the most painful things that we have to address in a human life, and thus in working with people and in mental health care, would be when attachment goes awry. Sometimes the people that are supposed to care for us, they can't, and they don't provide the things we need when we're little. We went through some of the examples of the things that really cultivate calm, the ability to self-soothe, and just strengths and resiliency in a baby and a human being. And in this episode, I'd like to talk about, or get started in talking about, when our attachment to others is really difficult, and how perhaps we can help people on their villain story also reduce their distress, increase their functioning, and just live a more beautiful life. And so I would like to preface the last point I have to talk about in this conversation, just that are my ideas. For episode 7 would be, how do we create a heaven on earth? How do we go from ideas like Belinda Carlisle to John Lennon and everyone's images in between, and look at what a beautiful world will look like, what our best life of doing the actions that we want to be doing, getting to the behaviors and functioning that we want to be in, what that looks like. So that's where we're going. And so just for a minute, I want to sit here in episode 6, and call it episode 666, the devil. But, the first thing that comes to mind when I say that is the devil is in the mundane. And I think that's where we experience hurt and pain and ruptures in trust the most in our daily life. The person who blocks paperwork, the bureaucrat who makes things really difficult for us. I'll probably insert a list here of just the tropes, the ideas that we have of people who really make this world a more painful and less harmonious and less functioning place. People who create destruction instead of creative, beautiful connection. And when we're dealing with clients, we might first get an inkling that our client has these negative personality types that might be more predatory or difficult to work with or painful to experience. And I always want to bring it back to, I believe that this is an attachment problem. And so I would talk just a tiny bit about my idea of something like an attachment compass that I can start to create and offer as a way to talk about this, because I love the compass of shame as a model, because it normalizes these not very fun behaviors that people have when they experience a very common and mandatory part of life, which is embarrassment, shame, when we disappoint ourselves, and the things we can do that are very dysfunctional in that moment. And when we externalize it into a picture like the compass, or a tool like the compass, it can be more helpful. And I wonder about trying to do some of that for attachment. So I'm just sketching here what we really want, I think, with as people, is to attach. Primarily, first we're gonna primarily, primordially, and eternally, we're always going to want to try to survive. And I think it's quite interesting. In fact, one of my teenage children pointed this out to me, that in our modern society, that desire to survive has even been short-circuited, and people are making decisions against that survival instinct, and we're having epidemics of loss of human beings, each one as much of a treasure to this humanity as the next. And my teenagers are aware of that, and they know my role and things that I work on in life. And so one of my teenagers brought that to me. Why are human beings going against their survival instincts? What's happening to us? And I do think that there's something to be said about the fact that survival is number one. And then beyond that is meaning and connection. We really can't survive in a vacuum. A child can be given everything in terms of like food, shelter, basic needs, but without connection to other human beings, that child won't live. And so there is something to us, there is some inherent need to connect, to commune, to attach. So I think when people aren't able to do that, or they do that for reasons where they turn the other people into maybe objects, there is something there where survival and attachment has had ruptures. So I even think, and I do here in a really simplistic way, that we could even look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a very simplistic sense, as initially we need to survive. All the little building blocks build up to surviving, and then once we pass that, we're really going to want to connect. And ultimately, I think Maslow even says that we want to connect with our creator, like a higher being. I could be wrong about that. You know, we ultimately want to move beyond survival into something like attachment. When attachment ruptures occur, I think ruptures in our sense of self occur as well. And let's see. I think this book is really interesting. It's called Why Am I Afraid to Love? But I thought this was great. You better not compromise yourself. It's all you've got. So when someone has ruptures in their modeling of attachment and they start to have behaviors against society, against their clinician, against others, against themselves, they've had a rupture in their sense of self. And we don't necessarily think of that, but I want us to think, this person is, we hear a lot, hurt people. But it's true, but it's very simplistic, and it's easy to be like, ugh, that saying bothers me. But what we know is if people are hurting other people, like how I would describe it is these attachment bonds have had ruptures, and the subsequent energy is an attempt to attach that's turning into more of an attack. And then there can be more complicated levels of that where someone rises up through a sophistication and a development process, but then still has an inability to connect, or sort of broken ways of seeking a destructive feeling instead of a creative and communal feeling. And then, I mean, I have some of those listed above, but I can just tell you, I think that's when people start to do things like drawing close and pulling away, and things that can really start to hurt. And there are things that can translate down into trying to provide care as well. I think a lot of times broken attachment doesn't look like predatory, super hurtful, violent, terrible behaviors. It might look like coming in strong, love bombing, and then withdrawing, and trying to see, as the person doing the behaviors, trying to see some effect of your life and your showing up in the world, and trying to see it have an effect on someone else, and just having that effect be negative because that's all you know how to do. So like drawing close and then avoiding, or purposely like seeming like you're avoiding people in a way that is hurtful, or perhaps some abandoning behaviors, like coming in, trying to get integral to someone and then abandoning because of seeing that panic that person will have when that rupture creates. We know how much those behaviors hurt. And when we see clients doing that, this is another piece. I'm always going to want to know about resources, and I'm always going to want to know, how do you ethically respond to that? How do we ethically respond when a client is hurting people around them, hurting themselves, and perhaps even trying to hurt us? Although we really need to caretake for the fact that we don't show up with emotional needs or emotional vulnerabilities in that same way as the regular person that the client is, or that you are going to meet, in your daily life. So you better not compromise yourself. It's all you got. And we better remember that when someone is doing these behaviors, it's incredibly painful to them. Nothing is really as painful as separation can be, emotionally. And so a person who's acting out, hurting others in any form, they are separating themselves from other people. I always tell my kids, we don't lie, and we just ask for privacy, and we don't keep bad and dangerous secrets, because when we lie to others, we push them away. We keep them away forever. We can never be close to them with those lies in between us. And so I just ask us to remember that these devils, these episode 666, let's talk about these bad people, that's not real. They're people who are in varying levels of pain, and sometimes that pain is so profound that there is no emotion that can even be triggered inside someone. And I think that we have to acknowledge that that is perhaps the ultimate expression of pain, and the human instinct can be to just pile more onto the person because what they're doing is so awful, but it will do nothing for us to just pile on. So I'd like to talk about some of the skills we can perhaps offer, even when people are so resistant, even if they seem bent on destruction in any of these forms, even if they're the next American Psycho or Homer Simpson or Mr. Burns, we can offer things. And so let's start with some accountability. I think I was about to say and I ran off, but this is one way that we can identify clients that might be struggling with some of these attachment problems, some of these impulses to attack or push away or hurt others, from this hopeless place of feeling that maybe they can survive, but they'll never achieve that higher purpose of life of communion and connection. And we really can't give up on people for that, and I really hope that we don't. And that's what I'm trying to express. Don't give up on yourself when you're in your villain story, and don't give up on others, please. Have this, I think, point from Carl Rogers, which is quite beautiful, which is in this book, Why Am I Afraid to Love? This is another one, carrying around to coffee shops, just as an experiment. Just let me know what happens. I don't know. Rogers maintains, once we have been accepted as we are and loved for what we are, the symptomatic problems with which most of us struggle in life will yield to this self-knowledge and acceptance. Okay, ideally, hopefully we can. Hopefully, and this is the ethical point that I keep coming back to, and I just hope I can harp on this, and that feel free to argue with me, I would love it, but we really ethically need to show up trying to find any resiliency, strength, beauty, anything we can to offer a person and say, these are some really great things about you. How can you be better? How can you be your best? How can you feel good about you? We really need to offer each client that work of self-esteem. Another really good resource, because number one, I'm going to want to ask a resource, how I can best offer support, especially on big topics like, why is there evil? Why do we suffer? Why are some people so committed to destruction? Why do people want to draw close as if they like us, but it's only to hurt us? What can we do about it? Once these terrible things happen, what can we do about that? So I think it's all just language until we can plant seeds and have those seeds germinate into bigger things, actions, political changes, attitude changes, anything. But one tangible skill, tangible seed, would be to look into programs such as this. This is just a little book of restorative justice. It's really fantastic. So I'll show you one thing I thought was really important for us to read is, we are all connected to each other and to the larger world through a web of relationships. When this web is disrupted, we are all affected. Interconnectedness must be balanced by an appreciation for particularity. Although we are connected, we are not the same. So we are all connected, and we all have a part to play in fixing problems too. Both the victim, the perpetrator, and the community will have a role. As an arms worker, you will have a role in addressing trauma, the villain stories, and the people who commit some villain stories as well. You'll have a chance to be part of an interconnected web that offers restoration and beauty after trauma and after sorrow. And I think reading this book, is the little book of restorative justice, is really fantastic. I think it's also really important to remember that I think the title of episode 7, all about how can we make world a heaven, would be, maybe, we'll see, I'm not there yet, but something like the importance of good deeds. Good deeds, good for your heart, good for your soul, good for your life, good for your functioning, reduces your distress and gives you a lot of meaning. It's a really magical thing. Good deeds might be the magic elixir for mental health distress or distress of our hearts. It's a good first thing to start. It's really good to look at how we feed ourselves healthily, body and mind, drinking lots of water, looking at the quality of our water, but then looking at the quality of our output, of our actions, the importance of good deeds. And so I preface that because I really don't like to hold people in a place of brokenness. That's absolutely antithesis to why I get up in the morning. You know, I really want to see people restored, healed, feeling good, feeling happy, or feeling their way through hard things. Just, you know, finding a way to have wonderful things happen after terrible things happen. You know, and so I don't want to stay stuck in these devils, even though we do need to talk about them. So I'm already jumping around. I'm jumping to episode 5 with attachment, and I'm jumping to episode 7 in my mind about heaven and how things could go really well and what ideal skills and ideal skills work might look like. But it's okay to sit here in the fact that sometimes people do jerky things, and we need to find a way for situations and relationships to rupture and to also have repair. The world can't burn down every time an angry spark ignites. There is a sort of phoenix quality to our world. When we lose someone, the sun rises the next day. It's very beautiful and it's very terrible too. And we can't run away from the dark things in life. In fact, it's more likely, and I'll bring up one of my favorite dark books, The People of Lie. But I think it's one of the things brought in this book to our attention is that when people have destructive behaviors, when things don't go right when they're around, a lot of the times what's really going on is an inability for that person to face some of the more difficult emotions in life, whatever they determine to be the more difficult emotions. And sometimes that is even good emotions like being close, having intimacy, having trust. That's not necessarily a good emotion. But there is in people, maybe Dr. Peck would call them evil, we might say narcissist, we might say all sorts of words that aren't going to perfectly describe each person, but the jerks that we meet in life, they have a resistant refusal to take on challenging emotions, and especially a resistant refusal to take on accountability. So at the very first step, we are definitely going to want to communicate to clients that accountability is part of our work. What's going to help us determine how someone falls in the range of ability to attach, in the range of ability to feel their own emotions, and to do the work needed to address emotions that are distressing them at that time. It's very important. And it's also very important for our work to be effective, because if we show up to sessions and the person won't show up, it's not going to work. If we have just all these cancellations last minute, lots of deception in the work, even sometimes if we have someone continually trauma dumping in ways that are really not helping them, there are lots of ways that we can see that there are behaviors coming up that are going to give us a lot of information, and they're also going to be really workable times for us to offer these interventions that are not so easy. It's a lot about holding people accountable to things that they do not want to be held accountable to. And I think it's really important to remember that when someone is acting out, so this might be a bit of like the motivation behind why someone would like attack their own victim. But, you know, a predominant characteristic, this is Dr. Peck, in the behavior of those he calls evil is scapegoating, because in their hearts they consider themselves above reproach. Now, let's stop and put a pin in that. So that is the mental world that they've created to protect a very painful reality, which is that likely somewhere within their development, they actually were not provided what they needed. Those survival needs were not met, and those self-esteem building and connection building skills were not provided. And generally what happens actually is the person just internalizes that because they're little, they're a child, and they think everything is their fault. They therefore were not worthy of whatever they noticed that they needed that they were not being provided, or whatever was very obvious that they needed that they were not being provided, such as like safety and comfort and a life free of pain, any of that. It's all terrible. And if we forget that someone might appear very arrogant and very into themselves while actually feeling infinitely devastated about their lack of value that they've really internalized. So it's not real that they actually know that they're beyond reproach. They've created a false narcissism, and it isn't warm and fuzzy. I just don't think it is, and I think it's a great distress, and I think it's very painful, and I just think we can't forget when we're pushed away from others, when there's lies in between us and others, when there's all a false mask, we're not close, we don't feel good. That doesn't feel good. It might appear as though it does. They might present as if they do feel good, but they don't. Anyway, so by creating this system in their mind where they're beyond reproach, anyone who brings up behavior that is very reproachable, shameful behavior, anyone, especially the victim of that behavior, becomes immediately the enemy. And I just think we could sit in that for a moment because it's so painful. Imagine someone's stabbing you and then they say, it's your fault. You hurt my hand when I stabbed you. I don't know, this is a terrible example, but I think we all know these moments where the person did the horrible thing and then they added insult to injury. They rubbed salt in our wounds. And if we can understand some little pieces of why this happens, it can help. These can be tangible ways of helping. While usually subtle, the destructiveness of these people is remarkably consistent. This is because those who have crossed over the line are characterized by their absolute refusal to tolerate the sense of their own sinfulness. While shame is so difficult, okay, one quick word about affect. I'm running out of space. We covered that not every cheeseball grin, I have a Cheshire Cat version of a cheesy grin here. Not every cheesy grin covers true happiness. Some people are really sad, but they have this firm affect that is protective. So I just want to remind us, first of all, no one is unworthy of our good care. We should always provide good care, even if they're being a jerk, but let's try to figure it out. But then some of these more difficult affects that also come along with some of those more difficult behaviors would be like this resistant affect that doesn't match the situation, perhaps sort of a Cheshire grin. Let's try, because I want to throw out some skills here, not just such a bummer about jerks, but what are the skills? So let's try to see through, hey, I know. Let's try to see through the affect let's try to see the details that are actually there and watch patterns. And then let's ask about the details. Let's perhaps even ask about the rigid affect that doesn't seem to match like the behavior. Or like if someone's saying, I love it. I just love cheating on my spouse. I love stealing from people, from my grandma, you know? Who knows? If it doesn't quite match, this cheeseball grin doesn't really match what the emotion is that you think would be more naturally part of that situation. You know, these are the same skills of addressing the self with positive regard that I talked about in, I think, episode 3, you know, because not every lie is a malevolent act. People just want to be safe. They want to survive, and then they want to hopefully connect. If they can't connect, they still have a right to try to survive. And I think we should be very compassionate for people trying to put on a smile and navigate through this world when they're really terrified, feeling alone, and feeling really desolate. So I want to throw out a couple more Okay, so I'll spare us all me reading through Douglas Adams' When the Earth Gets Destroyed, but I do want to remind us that every little small bureaucratic way, we all have to queue up in line, we all deal with bureaucracy, we're all in it together, but those little ways that we make life harder for each other, they have rippling effects. And those little ways that we make life easier for each other, those have rippling effects too, so don't forget that. And then a book that's really good for having your best gut check about, you know, if someone really is a threat or not. It is important for us to stay safe, and we live in a world where anything is possible, and that, you know, people can have good actions or bad towards us. So I really like this book, The Gift of Fear. It says it really well on the back. True fear is a gift, unwarranted fear is a curse. Learn how to tell the difference. So this is a great resource. And then this book I've just found, and I'm just reading through. It was from a theological department staff that had left, so I haven't read it yet. I've owned it for a while, but I found some really interesting parts in it that might talk about just this idea of, you know, the jerks who are violent. Where does some violence come from? Where can we maybe address it? Because this is what I really want to do, is offer more of a tangible way to address. So I thought chapter 4 in this book was really interesting, and it's called Embracing Mortality. And it discusses how the idea of telling boys that the only ways that they can be emotional is to be predisposed to stop a physical attack. So that's what their emotions are meant to be trained to look towards, that will have an effect on relationships, and that's quite obvious, but the book is still beautiful and like has a lot of good points about that. I liked how this author wrote that he was told to be a good boy, be a good soldier, keep going, not care about his emotions, and then suddenly his dad died, and those messages were still there, but the pain and an inability to process those feelings were also there without the tools that he needed. This one section was kind of good. There's no pervasive scientific evidence to date that can explain the preponderance of male violence in terms of biological predisposition. But there's some data that hormonal differences might make a modest difference in aggressiveness, but the major factor is clearly societal influence. Now, we can argue about that, but dang, is that a good place for conversation? Why do things get violent? How can we assess? How can we use that gift of fear, but not the curse